Thank you, Terry. And thank you all for inviting me to share my observations about the revisit program to Korea and the Korean War. I understand I'm allotted 25 minutes, and so if I'll try to finish before you all hit for the exits. Terry mentioned in the introduction, I'm part of a veterans group. We visit local high schools and share our experiences. I believe that future generations really should understand why we got involved in the Korean Civil War and what was accomplished. As a matter of fact, I think there's a lot of adults who are also a bit hazy about that war. Before I go any further, I really want to let you all know I did not do anything heroic compared to what other American soldiers did in experience in that war. You know, for many years, South Korea has sponsored revisit programs for Korean veterans to thank them for the freedom and economic success of their country. As a member of a recent group of veterans visiting South Korea, I have to tell you, we were treated with so much respect and courtesy, it was almost embarrassing. Here's a photo of our group. There are 120 veterans in this group, along with their spouses and family members. The entire cost of the week's visit, including hotel, food, tours, etc., is paid by our host, the Republic of South Korea. It was amazing, amazing reception we had. Now, the first part of my presentation will be my impressions of today's Korea. The second will be my observations about the war and a little bit about my personal experience in that war. You all have received handouts on your tables which list every battle during the war and a map of the Korean Peninsula. I'll refer to the handouts on the map during my presentation to hopefully help explain why the war was so important to today's South Koreans. After the armistice was signed, July 1927, 1953, my Jeep driver and I drove into Seoul. All I could see was a city of ashes and smoke. I don't think I saw a building over 3 or 4 stories tall. Here's a photo of Seoul back then. You can tell this illustrates the destruction of Seoul after the city changed hands 4 times. First by the North Koreans, then by the Chinese, and twice by the UN forces. And now the next photo you'll see is from my hotel room with my smartphone. I took a photo of the Seoul skyline. You can see the contrast between 1953 and 2013 as we go along here. Next morning, I went to the city center and had a photo of the city center. You can see that a large poster right in the middle of city center thanking the United Nations and Americans for their contribution. Next to our hotel was a construction of a building going to be 123 stories. When it's completed in 2015, it'll be the 2nd tallest building in the world. Can you believe that? Well, the tallest building, by the way, I think is Dubai in the airport. When the war ended, it would have been just impossible to imagine a vibrant city with skyscrapers and a country with a strong economic base. The estimates would take, back then, would take over 100 years to rebuild South Korea back to pre-war levels, standards, but with financial help from the United States and other countries, it only took 60 years. This may come as a surprise to you. But South Korea is 10 years ahead of the United States and most other countries in the world in terms of technology and a well-organized system. For example, the Incheon airport where we landed is the ranked #1 in the world as the most efficient airport in the world. 80% of Incheon, when the war ended, by the time the war ended, was destroyed. 80% was destroyed. And today it's ranked 2nd in terms of growth potential among world cities. Another example is when the war ended, South Korea only had 1 bridge still intact. Today they have 23 bridges with marvelous architecture. You know, we have a problem building 1 bridge between all Oregon and Washington. You know, it's really impossible to share with you all of in the next few minutes, all of these ceremonies and reenactments that I will show you, but I will show you photos of two reenactments. I have to tell you, Steven Spielberg could not have directed a better production of these reenactments. You can see here, just one of many photos we took. And there are many battles. However, from my purpose today, I'm really going to break the Korean War down into 4 stages. First stage of the war, the Battle of Pusan Perimeter. If you look on your map, at the lower end of Korea, you can see Pusan, and you'll see the Pusan Perimeter. After crossing the 38th parallel and capturing Seoul, the North Korean army pushed the smaller South Korean army all the way down to the Pusan Perimeter. And this is where the U.S. troops, in early August 1950, arrived to support the South Korean army. The unfortunate situation was that this first group of American soldiers were under strength, not really prepared to fight a guerrilla warfare against a Russian-trained North Korean army. However, in spite of this handicap, they were still able to stop the North Koreans. You know, the U.S. Army suffered 6,000 casualties during that war, during that battle, which was twice the number, 3,000 casualties we suffered on the Omaha beach landing in Normandy in World War II. Some other facts, not too well known, is that there were hundreds of Americans captured during that first part of the war, stage of the war, and were captured and were massacred by the North Koreans army. This is pointed out on page 2 of your handout. The dates: August 17th, September 19th, October 20th, 23rd. The first, you know, the North Koreans, they were cruel. The Chinese were tough, but they weren't as cruel as the North Koreans. The first stop on our tour was to the Nangtam River on the Pusan Perimeter. We watched the reenactment of the battles along the Nangtam River. Here's photos of the soldiers in the trenches. If you look carefully, you can see them. And then, actually, at one part of the ceremony, the soldiers would put on North Korean uniforms, waving their North Korean flags, and reenactment of the attacking the South Koreans and American soldiers. Anyway, in the next photo you'll see is a photo of the schedule. You can't read it perhaps, but I just want to let you see how well planned that whole thing was. As I said, Steven Spielberg couldn't have done a better job of getting this whole thing done. Now going into the second stage of the war, the Incheon landing on the west coast of Korea. Point to the map. You can notice on the west side of Incheon, of Korea, and page 2, please note the date, September 15th, 1950. General MacArthur planned to reverse the direction of the war by conducting a surprise amphibious landing on Incheon port. The Incheon landing became one of the most brilliant moves in American military history. He was able to cut off all the supplies coming down from the north to the North Korean army down in Pusan perimeter, and it was remarkable. No other nation in the world had the means and knowledge to put together 200 ships, 70,000 troops successfully. It was amazing. This time, a well-trained and better trained American troops were able to recapture Seoul within a few days, and the North Korean army was caught by surprise and pretty much destroyed. The UN forces now were able to move north up to the China border. Our veterans, our veterans group was very fortunate to attend. Oh, there it is. Attend the 63rd anniversary of the Incheon landing, which happened 63 years ago to the day we were there. It was really a marvelous ceremony. We witnessed the Korean military reenact the landing with helicopters, landing crafts, helicopters and fighter aircraft. Like the ceremony we witnessed in Nangtan, it was an amazing demonstration by the South Korean Army, Air Force, and Navy. Here's a photo, next photo of there you can see some of the helicopters coming down with their ceremony. Show the next photo, please. Oh, these girls are terrific. Every one of these little pre-teenagers would come and take each one of our veterans by the hand and lead us to our seat in the bleachers. Notice the next photo. Next one, please. Notice the spectators. Notice the sign above the bleachers, both in English and in Korean. And by the way, you notice they're all wearing those white caps? A gift by the Korean Navy, and I'm wearing one of those hats. On the front is 63rd Incheon Landing, and there must have been thousands of these hats passed out. You may wonder why South Korea places so much emphasis on their military. Keep in mind, Seoul is only 25 miles from the border. And a sobering thought is that 70% of the North Korean army is within 60 miles of that border. That explains why South Korea has a total of 600 active and reservists, which is the sixth largest and most efficient army in the world. Like Israel, a tour of duty in the military is compulsory. Later in the week, we traveled to Panmunjom at the demilitarized zone, DMZ as you'll hear it as an acronym. We saw a South Korean outpost stationed all along the DMZ. There's no way any Korean could ever sneak into South Korea, I guarantee you that. Here's a photo of the North Korean headquarters at Panmunjom. If you look carefully, I don't know if you can see it here, there's a guard, North Korean guard, looking at us, and we're looking at him. Strange. Now the next photo is inside the hut. Lynn and I, where the armistice negotiations were signed, took place. Note one of the honor guards. These guys are unbelievable. These guys stood at attention for hours. And it's our understanding they're all black belt graduates. No phones were allowed in the American military zone, but we were allowed to take photos inside the huts. Former Secretary Leon Panetta said, of the Korean Peninsula, we're within an inch of a war almost every day in that part of the world. And I think I heard on the news last couple of days, North Korea is starting to do another test drives of their energy and nuclear energy. Anyway, now let's get into the third stage of the war. And that's when China entered the war and came to the aid of their North Korean neighbors. In late November, 300,000 Chinese communists in a brilliant feat of mass infiltration crossed the border into Korea and began an attack on the UN forces. The first targets were the US Army and Marines units stationed at Chosun Reservoir. Here you see a map, a line of fire. Oh, don't go there yet. Thanks. You notice the map on your map, upper right-hand corner, a circle of Chosun Reservoir. Of the 300,000 Chinese, over 120,000 Chinese surrounded these smaller U.S. positions at the Chosun Reservoir. Please note, page 3 of the handout, the date, November 27th, 1950. Chinese attacked a U.S. task force of less than 3,000 soldiers and killed the entire unit. The remains of the unknown men who fell there still lie unmarked in North Korea. The weather was the worst in decades, with 30 to 35 degrees below zero, 100 degrees below zero, wind chill. Here you see the line of troops, line of fire. I did not take this photo, but this is show you what the situation was as far as the cold weather. A Marine officer said he had to walk up and down the line of emplacements to keep the troops moving. So you had to keep moving to prevent freezing. Lethargy was a death sentence. In just 17 days, the Marines and Army units had 12,000 casualties, and many who just froze to death. Now, these numbers may not sink in. I'm throwing out a lot of these killed in action, wounded, and all that. But to put that in perspective, 6,000 were killed in only 17 days. 6,000 and 3,500 were killed in Iraq over 10 years. 2,100 were killed in Afghanistan in 12 years. Yeah, we had 6,000 killed in 17 days. It's amazing. The remaining Army and Marine units were forced to retreat, if you look on your map, to the Hangnam Harbor on the east coast of Korea, where the ships were waiting to transport them to South Korea. You can go to the next one. Oh, there I am. Well, we'll come to that in a few minutes. No, don't go here. Don't go there yet. By the way, on that, when the Marines came down from Chosun Reservoir to the harbor, they also escorted 98,000 North Korean refugees. And today, there are over 1 million descendants of those 1 million refugees in South Korea. To give you an idea why we were so welcome by the general population in South Korea. The progress was delayed by a military tradition of never leaving a soldier behind, and the dead and wounded were loaded onto trucks. In order to fit the frozen bodies onto the trucks, they had to break arms and legs to make room. I mention this just to remind you that there's nothing glamorous about war as depicted in the movies. It's ugly business, and I see no reason to sugarcoat some of the side effects. Note on page 3 of your handouts, I already did that? Oh yeah, on page 3 of your handouts, on the January 1 to 15, 500,000 Chinese pushed the forces back down the 38th parallel again, and UN forces had to abandon Seoul. A few months later, the UN forces counterattacked and recaptured Seoul. Now the battle lines stood along the 38th parallel. I'm going to have to move along here pretty fast because I want to keep within my time parameter. The negotiations in the fourth stage and final stage of the war, we had negotiations and what we call Battle for the Hills. In June 1951, the United Nations offered to open truce negotiations, and both North Korea and China accepted. Negotiations were slow and difficult. Lasted for 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Politicians just don't know when to stop, do they? The agreement was that UN forces would not cross north over the 30th parallel, and the Chinese would not cross south over the 38th parallel. However, in those negotiations, they did not agree on. A ceasefire agreement was not included in the negotiations. This omission was very important because, as you will note on page 1 of your handouts, 46% of all the American casualties occurred after they started talking about the truce. Not before, but after. Wow. Chinese took advantage of the slow pace of negotiations to occupy many hills as possible in order to influence the truce talks. As a result, 30,000 more American troops during this fourth stage of the war lost their lives, and the war now turned into trench warfare similar to World War I. I assume you all understand about trench warfare and World War I, what that was like. Okay, I think in order for brevity, this is when I came into the war, March of I entered Korea in 1953, March of 1953. In order for brevity, let me just say my early experience. I was drafted in 1951, went to basic training, and then was accepted to go to an aircraft officers candidate school, like one of our OCS graduates. And then was stationed at the East Coast Air Defense Command. And then after graduation, my first assignment was at the Air Defense Command on the East Coast. In early 1953, as I mentioned, I was transferred to Korea. When I arrived in Korea in March 1953, I was told enemy aircraft was no longer a threat. Instead, I was needed as an artillery forward observer. I explained to my superiors I had no training about the duties of an artillery forward observer. They said, "No problem, Lieutenant. This will be on-the-job training." And they assigned an experienced sergeant to teach me. The ropes. I have a lot of respect for sergeants, by the way. I was told the reason for this assignment, because they needed a replacement. So I said, "Well, who am I replacing?" I was informed there's a shortage of forward observers because of increased casualties. You can imagine this is really great for my morale. I was excited about this whole thing. And now we get to my picture. This is on my way up to the outpost. There I am. I was issued a .45 revolver and a flak jacket and sent on my way. I was assigned to 7th Infantry Division, stationed on the front lines, facing the Chinese on a hill called Old Baldy. I was issued with 45 revolvers, you can see, a flat jacket. Anyway, I accepted this assignment. However, I must tell you, being assigned to infantry on the front lines was really not what I anticipated when I was leaving the States. Here's a photo of Old Baldy. Here from my outpost. And by the way, I took this photo with my Eastman Kodak Browning camera. So when I go to the high schools, I have to explain to these students what Eastman Kodak Browning camera looked like. It was not a smartphone. Anyway, the hill got the nickname because there's a series of 5 battles for that war, and every tree and bush had been destroyed. Is that clear? There's nothing growing on that hill. The Chinese were deeply dug in, connecting tunnels and bunkers. My job was to dislodge them, and by directing artillery whenever I saw some activity. The objective was to prevent them from assembling sufficient troops to infiltrate our positions. A sample entry in my daily morning report usually has a statement like, received rounds, which was a polite way of saying we were targeted and fired on. Looking back on my experiences, the power and responsibility that was placed in 22, 23-year-old lieutenants like me was really interesting. One call from me on a field radio could bring a more destructive power than an entire infantry battalion. Show the next photo shows landing on Old Baldy. There's, again, taken with my Browning camera. You can see the shells landing on Old Baldy. You can see the destructive force these shells had. Students have asked me if I ever killed anybody. I have to be careful how I answer that question. I tell them I have no idea how many Chinese became casualties or American lives saved as a result of my duties. Here's a photo of my outpost where I was stationed. Now, let me tell you, this is the fortifications, which was typical along the line during that battle for hills. Please note how we used sandbags to absorb incoming artillery, trenches to protect us from sniper fire, barbed wire to prevent the infiltration attempt. This photo, by the way, was taken after the armistice was signed because it had been too dangerous to stand on top of this bunker before the armistice, of course. The final part of my talk today, and I still have a few moments left, is about a battle that left a lasting impression on me. Please note, on page 5, date July 6, 1953, the Pork Chop battle. Pork Chop was the outpost to my right. On night of July the 6th, the Chinese, using a massive number of infantry, attacked an attempt to occupy that hill. Remember, this is the whole thing, and the fort, to get as much control as many hills as possible in order to influence those true stalks. There's a typical human wave attack style of moving carpet Chinese swimming up the hill, in perfect English. Yeah, I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I remember what I heard 60 years ago. In perfect English, the Chinese, on their loudspeakers, telling our troops to surrender, or if not, you're all going to die. They announced they're going to take Pork Chop, and they would take no prisoners. No words can describe what a horrific spectacle I observed. Chinese were ferocious fighters, and it was brutal, close quarter, hand-to-hand fighting. It was an indescribable hell. I don't know what it was about their culture. They would send them right into heavy fire, and why they're so willing to die and fight to the death, I was told it had to do with honor. I don't know what honor there was there. After only 5 days of fighting, the casualties on Pork Chop included 243 killed, 916 wounded, and 163 of our dead have never been recovered. 5 days, similar to that Chosun Valley example I gave you earlier. The compression of casualties was unbelievable. By the way, there's a book called On Hallowed Ground. In page 5, you notice there's one sentence about the Pork Chop battle. Here's a book, The Last Battle of Pork Chop, 500 pages. And by the way, there's also a video on the Chosun Valley battle, and I do not suggest that you get this if you have a weak stomach, because it's very graphic. Anyway, keep in mind the Chinese only wanted these hills for political reasons to influence true stalks winning was no longer an option. Also note on page 5, handout for Outpost Harry. Of the 200 troops, you got Outpost Harry on there? No? Yes? Yeah, there it is. The battle for Outpost Harry on June 10th, 1953. Of the 200 troops defending the hill, only 30 walked away alive. A few weeks after the Pork Chop battle, I was completing my assignment, was reassigned to a radar observation post and also promoted to a first lieutenant. Actually, I was very lucky. I found out later, the night before the armistice was signed, the Chinese infiltrated my former outpost, and unfortunately my replacement was killed. They come in with their Uzi machine guns and spray the inside of the bunker. I'm guessing my replacement had just arrived in Korea and probably did not believe the Chinese would attack the day before the signing of the armistice. I was unprepared for the infiltration. I assumed the Chinese decided to finish the war in a blaze of glory. And finally, I will say, the Korean War is called the Forgotten War because of the sandwich between World War II and the controversies of the Vietnam War. I suggest it will also be known as the bloodiest war in the 20th century. 40,000 Americans died and 104,000 were wounded in the most horrific combat and weather conditions in the history of warfare. South Korea Army fared even worse than others. Than the huge casualties in the South Korean Army, there were somewhere between 3 and 4 million South Korean civilians who died, and 300,000 war widows, 100,000 orphans as a result of that war. On the handout, I'd like to call your attention to page 6. Comments by Eric Severide 60 years ago. I reflected on his observations. I was told that I was needed as a forward observer. I accepted with a sense of honor and patriotism. Today our forces are again fighting wars in foreign countries, and they have similar sense of honor and patriotism, even knowing that their country is divided about the very purpose of these wars. And finally, let me show. When I go to the high schools, I always like to show a before and after. Here's yours truly, graduating from OCS. Here's the same guy after a tour of duty in Korea. A change of demeanor, as you will note. Anyway, we prevented North Korea from occupying South Korea. Today, South Korea is free. North Korea's people are starving. God bless America, and thank you very much.